So I wanted to make a quick video to kind of give some advice to if you're a beginner and you're building an application, you never really hosted it anywhere. Where should you deploy? Where should you host your applications? And there's a lot of options out there. I mean, you have like Vercel, you have Railway, which is what I like to use on my applications right now. There's Fly.io. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you could literally go and spin up a virtual machine like a VPS for $5 a month. Or if you want to go and get a dedicated server, like you want to get a bunch of cores for some reason, you can pay maybe like what, 50, 60 bucks for that or something every month. But there's different options. But as a beginner, what I would highly recommend doing is you should spend some time trying to, instead of reaching for a platform as a service off the bat, you should probably invest a little bit of time to understand like how does your application actually run. So I'm going to walk you through the journey of like, if you're starting off, allocate a little bit of time, try different platforms, try Vercel, see how you like it, try Railway, try Fly.io, understand their UIs, understand what works good about them, what works bad about them. So my first advice to you, if you're a beginner, is try different things. Don't just try one and like say, oh, well, my app is deployed now, everything's good. Vercel has different deployment things under the hood that can make stuff a little bit confusing, such as like a serverless and edge environment. Railway uses Docker to build your containers. Fly.io, I think, also does a container host. And then, of course, just hosting your own VPS is an approach. And so if you get time, I would highly recommend to go through this process and just understand a little bit more about hosting and how stuff works. So the first thing I would recommend doing is go to like DigitalOcean or go to any type of service that can quickly spin up a VPS for you. And I would say pick one that has a decent amount of cores and memory, and it's like 20 bucks a month on like DigitalOcean, and just use it for a couple days. They're only going to charge you like $1 or $2. And the idea is that you want to understand how do you actually, first of all, get into this machine? Because there's a lot that goes into hosting your own application. So this is you and your little laptop. And so how do you actually get into this machine that you just bought, right? When you spin up this machine, you get an IP. So I'll just go ahead and put like the local host IP, but you'll get some random public IP, which you can use something called SSH to get inside the box. So this is the first thing that you want to learn is SSH. How do I get inside this machine? And this is important because this machine is basically just like any other machine. You have to get into it. You have to install software. You have to do updates. You have to get your application inside of this machine somehow so that you can run it. Okay, so step one, learn about SSH, learn about how to get into the machine. When you're trying to learn about SSH, one thing that's going to be apparent to you is you need to learn about SSH keys. Okay, so you might bring in like an SSH keygen, which is going to create a public and private key on your laptop. And then when you try to SSH into this machine, it's going to send over your key. It's going to update something called like a known host file in your own machine so that it knows that who you're talking to is actually who you're supposed to be talking to. And that kind of gets stored in the machine as well. And again, this process is so that you have a better understanding of how some of this stuff works, right? Because you can't just connect directly to the machine. There's going to be either a password that you need, and sometimes you spin up a machine and they recommend that you use SSH keys. And so when you're actually in the UI spinning it up, they'll ask for a prompt for your public key. And this is kind of to help you understand how this all works, right? You generate a SSH key on your laptop, you get a public key, you put it on the machine when it spins up, and that allows you to SSH into it to do some stuff. Also, when you're doing this, you should probably look into SSH tunnels. This is kind of important. This is basically you pass in a certain flag when you do the SSH command. And if you have a service running on this VPS, when you set up a tunnel, it basically acts like that service is running on your local network. And so you can actually access, using localhost : a port, you can access some of the machines or the services that are running on the side of the VPS. So SSH tunnels, very important to understand. Let's move on a little bit more. So inside the machine itself, it's going to have a certain operating system, right? So a lot of these have either CentOS, Ubuntu, Debian might be one. If you're using like Amazon Linux, that might be one. But the idea is that these operating systems are all a little bit different. Some use different package managers. You might be using apt. I think it's also called like apt-get. You could be using yum. So these are different package managers, which I should probably label package managers, which live inside the operating system. And hopefully you already know this. Like this is, again, this video is kind of more for beginners. And so you're going to spin up a box that's going to have a particular operating system. Let's just say CentOS or something. Now, off the top of my head, I don't know what CentOS uses. It probably uses yum, and I think Ubuntu uses app. So there's going to be a package manager on this machine. And when you first SSH into it using this SSH key, which again, you'll say SSHI, and you'll say like path to key.pim. And then you're going to put the IP over here, which my head is hiding, so I apologize for that. So I'm going to put that IP. I'll say like root at 127.0.0.1, and that is the username that's going to allow you to get into that machine. And that's kind of the idea of it, right? So you're going to have a special key you can get into the machine, and then once you're on the machine, typically what you want to do is, play around, try to learn how to run some commands. So run some commands. Typically, the first command that you're going to end up running is going to be like an apt-get update, or maybe like a yum update or something, because the machine they spin up might be a little bit outdated, and you want to make sure that the packages on it are like all kind of updated. Secondly, you might not be familiar with how you actually do things with the terminal, so you're going to have to learn how to use Vim, right? I would very highly recommend that you learn Vim. If you want to get fancy, you can install NeoVim, stuff like that. And so when you're on the machine itself, you can open up files and modify them with Vim, or if you want to use Nano or whatever else is on the machine, that's cool too. I'm trying to just walk you through a little bit because these are things you're not going to learn if you just deploy your app to a platform as a service. And so doing this type of stuff is very good to at least have done once. You might not enjoy it, you might not like it, but once you've learned it, you kind of appreciate how nice it is to go into Vercel and just point it to your repo and everything just works. So if you're in the machine, you might notice that you don't have like a UI. You don't have anything that you can actually view inside the machine. So you have to kind of do all your work using commands. Now, some of the most useful commands you're going to end up needing include PS, which is to kind of show like all the processes that are on the machine. LS will list out all the files that are in your current working directory. PWD will print out the current working directory. You have CD, and that's how you can change into different directories. Cat is how you can print out a file directly to your terminal, which is pretty useful. You have grep, which is kind of a tool that you use in combination with cat. So like, let's say you have a file called like logs. You can do grep and just find any line that has a particular thing in it. So like I could search for like webdev inside my log file. And of course, just learning all the other file system things like copy files, makedir, moving files, stuff like that. And so I would go through and just learn all these commands if you want to like get more familiar. And these are going to translate to when you're doing local development in like VS Code. Because I mean, if you see me in code, there's a bunch of commands that you can run locally to basically navigate your computer locally. But it's the same when you get used to using a terminal locally. It's the same as getting into a machine and doing some things. Okay, so now it's like, how do we actually run that service? Okay, so over here on our laptop, we might have a Docker image, or we might have like some code, and we want to somehow get it on this machine. Now, the easiest thing I have seen people do is they'll basically just install Git inside the machine, and then they will just do like a Git clone. So like, here's your little repo over here. They clone it into the machine at some location. So like this could be like /projects /my project like this. This is one approach. So basically just clone your project into the machine, and then you can CD into that project location. You can start doing an npm install to pull in all the dependencies, and then you can do like an npm run to have that machine running. Okay, and that's pretty cool. But also, like, sometimes you want to get files into machines. How do you get files into this machine itself? Well, there's something called secure copy. That's something that you should probably learn as well. And then again, you have to pass it your SSH key. And so I could say like key.pim, and then I can say I want to take a file that's local on my machine. So I can say like my file, and I want to move it over to root at 127.0.0.1 / and you can do a location here. So I could say like /projects, something like that. So basically take the file that's in my computer and move it to the remote machine inside of this directory. And then go look up the syntax. If I mess this up, I apologize, but I'm pretty sure that's how it works. So now that you know how to kind of like get your project into this machine, or you can copy files into the machine, you should be able to run your service, and now your service is running on a particular port. But the issue is that when you actually try to access your public IP address on the port, you're not going to have HTTPS, right? And so another thing you're going to end up doing is you're probably going to have to learn how to install Nginx, or Caddy is one that I like using. Caddy is very easy to get set up, where you basically install a service called Caddy, and it's going to be running on either 80 or 443, I believe, is the HTTPS port. And so if someone from the internet wants to access your machine, they're actually going to hit this Caddy service, and this Caddy service is going to be running in front of your own service. Like your service might be called, I don't know, I'll say app, and that's going to be on port 8000 or something. And so Caddy is going to basically sit in front of your service. Now, the reason it's going to do that is because Caddy behind the scenes is going to set up your HTTP certificates, and then your traffic will be served over HTTPS, which is pretty nice. But now, how do you actually get a domain? So now you have to go and figure out how to set up a domain. So like 5 is like set up a domain. And so you're going to go to Namecheap or Cloudflare or whatever, buy a domain. You have to point your domain to this public IP address of the machine. And then secondly, you have to go into Caddy or Nginx or Apache, and you have to add a record to say, hey, when someone hits this machine with a host name of mysuperapp.com, it knows to route that domain to your running service. Okay, but there's a little bit more, because this service, it's just one little node service running by itself. What happens if it crashes? Now it doesn't come back online. And so you have to kind of put in some work to make sure that this service never fails. And there's different ways. There's like things built into the operating system, like systemd, I believe, and there's like other things as well. I've lost touch with this lower level stuff. I used to be pretty good at it. But also there's stuff like PM2 or Forever. And these are scripts that you can basically run if you're using like Node.js. And you can say, hey, I want to make sure that this thing always runs. And if it were to crash, just go ahead and restart it. The cool thing about PM2 as well is it runs in a cluster mode. So you could potentially, if you have like 5 cores or 6 cores in this machine, you could spin up a bunch of these things and try to utilize all the cores, right? And so learning all that's pretty cool. I mean, now you feel like you're Superman, you like know everything about servers. If you make changes to your application, how do you deploy new updates? Well, right now your process is pretty janky. You basically have to SSH into the machine. You have to stop your service manually. Then you have to repull changes from your Git repo, and then you rerun npm install, and then you rerun PM2, and now your service is running. So you have a little bit of downtime, which could potentially kind of be bad. Now, some approaches to get around this is obviously you could write scripts, right? You can write bash scripts that do all this process for you. Having a little bit of downtime is not that big of a deal. You could just have like a cron job on the machine that checks every day or every morning to, hey, should I grab updates? But personally at this point, maybe the next steps are, can I actually kind of make this a little bit easier? In my opinion, it would be, yeah, you can. And that's by using Docker and Docker Compose. So instead of actually having to go into the machine and install whatever dependencies you need to run Node and run Caddy, you're going to go and you're going to install Docker. So there would be like a Docker daemon that you install on this machine, including Docker Compose, which it might already be bundled into Docker. I have to kind of refresh my memory about that. So now that you have Docker, instead of your machine needing to pull in GitHub and you have to kind of remind it that, hey, you need to pull in GitHub, what you do is you have your code and you basically, you push some code to your Git repo, and that is going to kick off a GitHub action or like a Circle CI pipeline or something. So that's going to run a GitHub action based on your code changes, and that's going to build and publish a Docker container. So let's just go ahead and get a container over here, or an image, I guess they call it. The container is the actual running thing. And so now this is actually going to be stored in like Docker Hub, or you can use like ECR or wherever you want to store this stuff, I guess. But now, instead of you having to go into the machine and like pull your code and restart Node, you now have like this Docker daemon, right? You now have like Docker Compose running, which I guess technically you'd have to SSH into the machine and run it. But every time you run Docker Compose, it's going to check for updates to see, is your service or is your Caddy configuration changed? So now instead of having to clone your whole project into this repo, you basically just like a Docker Compose YAML file, and that declares what Docker images you need. And so you can just SSH into the machine, set up a cron job to have this run every 5 minutes or every minute, or you can have the GitHub action after it's done pushing the Docker Hub. You can just go and trigger the machine to say, hey, rerun your Docker Compose up command. Okay. And that'll rerun and basically say, hey, check if Docker Hub has any images that are new. And if it does, it's going to go ahead and download the image. And there's ways to set up Docker Compose and not have downtime deployments. And so it's just going to get the new image. It's going to tear down your old image, bring up the new image of your service. And now you still have like everything running perfectly fine, right? You still have Caddy that would be configured in some type of way with your deployed Caddy image maybe. And again, just correct me if there's anything I'm saying that I missed. I mean, I'm just trying to give a quick overview and I don't want this video to go too long. But now you have like this pretty cool setup where like everything is just, you run one command and all your services, like even if you need like a database, you don't want to have to go and run MySQL or Postgres install on your machine. It's nice if you just let Docker Compose spin one up and you point that to like a virtualized volume mount. Okay, so now you have like a volume mount here and it has a database running and it's going to basically read and write from that volume mount. So now you're cooking. Now you're really like a system admin, right? Or like a DevOps engineer. But someone comes along and says, hey, you know what? This one machine is just not going to handle enough traffic. You need more machines. So now how do you actually like spin up more machines? So you basically have to do this process again and you clone it all. And now you have 2 VPSs that are running all the same stuff. I'll just go ahead and keep this simple and just do that. But now you have to get some type of load balancer. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and say like load balancer, and that's going to be like Nginx or Caddy. And that is going to sit in front. Let me just delete some of the stuff. That's going to sit in front of your 2 machines here. Okay. So you have like a service running over here, and you'll have a service running over here. And when a user needs to access your stuff, instead of them hitting the service directly, sorry, this video is all over the place. It's kind of a mess, but okay. So now instead of the user hitting your service directly, they can just hit your load balancer, and the load balancer will have configuration to say, hey, when a request comes into example.com, I need you to either route to the machine over there or the machine over here, right? So this could potentially be like a different IP. And so your load balancer is going to figure out, okay, well, round robin, every time a user makes a request, this is our little user, they make a request to your domain, the domain's going to be routed to the load balancer now instead. That's going to make some type of round robin load balancing between your two servers, do the request, and send that back. That's pretty cool, right? But at this point, it doesn't make sense to have like a database living on one of the VPSs and like not on the other. So like you might say, well, you know what I actually want to do is I'm going to have another machine. This is going to have like the database on it. So let's just like move off the database into its own machine, and we'll like go put it over here. And then these things could just like access the database on this other machine, so we can scale this machine up independently. And then you're like, okay, well, how do we actually automate this? Because this was a lot of work. And if you have a bigger project, like you don't have to go and manually spin up machines and do this every single time, right? You want to be able to click a button and you have like a brand new VPS already spun up with everything on it. And so now you start looking into infrastructure as code tools. For example, you might be looking into like Puppet or Chef or Ansible, where you can have a quick VM spun up for you. And then when that VM is set up, you'd have some type of orchestration tools to go ahead and spin up and install Docker and have that all set up the Docker hub and you know, set up the correct SSH keys and all that fun stuff and have it all configured. And you're like, okay, this is cool. But this was quite a lot of work. And so now you're like, okay, well, let's actually go and look into Kubernetes, because Kubernetes is going to do all this for me. It just automatically scales all this stuff. I just basically like write some configuration files. I do a kube control apply, and it'll spin up machines and Docker images and stuff like that. So now your project is really cooking, but you realize that all this work, and I could have just basically clicked on one button on a UI and have all this stuff deployed. And then when I want to scale it up, I just basically change how many instances I have running by clicking a toggle and go, I want 2 replicas. I hope you guys are having fun watching this video. I'm having some fun making it. But at this point, you like start contemplating your whole life and your whole career, and you're like, dude, I'm spending all this time doing all this setup and stuff. And it's like, I'm learning all these new tools, and for what? When I can just go into any type of platform as a service. For example, I'm going to show Railway just because I like it. I wish they pay me, but I just like their service. So for example, I can go into this UI and I can find down here, okay, I actually want to have 4 of these running. And I just click a button and it spins up 4 of my Docker containers that are running with my image that I built. And this is basically doing all this for me under the hood. And then I can go over here and you know what? I want a database. Let's just go ahead and spin up a Postgres database. And boom, I have this thing that is going to be able to spin up a database. I can connect to it. I'll have a database URL and an IP that I can connect to. And this again is like what we just did over here, but instead of having to do it manually and SSHing to the machine and like doing all this other stuff I just talked about, which by the way, I spent a lot of my career doing Puppet work, and I'm currently doing Terraform on my current project. This stuff is fun to a certain extent, and then you're like, dude, I just don't want to be doing this. I want to ship value. Like, this is just not fun stuff. Some people love it. Some people love it, and there's a lot of projects and teams that need DevOps engineers. You can save a lot of money by just running on EC2 instances or just running on bare metal dedicated servers, but it comes at a cost, because unless you're very, very good at writing like automated scripts, there's one step that one DevOps engineer forgot to document, and then he leaves your project and you hire someone else. Like, it's just hard to keep all this stuff in your head. So you want to automate all of it. And to automate all of it, you learn all these tools, and then you spend a bunch of time, tackling with these tools, trying to get it to work. And you're like, you know what? I'm glad that I learned all this. This was awesome. This was fun. But at the end of the day, I'd rather just use Vercel. I'd rather just use Railway. I'd rather just use Fly.io. Just put my stuff in a single Docker image and run it, and not have to worry about any of this stuff. But again, as a beginner, I highly recommend at least try to host something on a dedicated server, because it's a very good learning experience. And there's a lot of stuff, especially the stuff up front I talked about, just hosting your own server, learning about SSH keys, learning about, all these nice server commands. They're very, very useful. Learning about how to host your own node service with PM2, or using like a Go server, that's cool too. How to deploy updates with downtime, how to deploy updates without downtime. These are things that you have to figure out. Finally, learning about Docker. Like Docker is probably the most valuable thing that you can learn, even if you don't get into this other stuff. Everything's based on Docker these days. So, before you just reach out to Railway and deploy your app, take some time to understand the complexity that some of these platforms as a service solve, because you just go into a UI, you click a button and it just works. But under the hood, I mean, there's stuff going on that you will not appreciate until you actually start doing. So I guess that's the point of this discussion is if you're learning, if you're a beginner, spend some time, try to deploy to a VPS and feel the pain a little bit. All right, have a good day. Happy coding.